I'm Mike Collins. On the Local News Roundup, early voting has begun in the fall midterms, but with fewer places to vote. CMS unveils Phase 1 of their new security plan and gives the go-ahead for Phase 2, while allegations of quid pro quo are revealed in dealings over municipal charter schools. Hurricane Michael takes out a part of the Lynx Blue Line and the streetcar for a couple of weeks, and Ray Carruth is about to get out of prison. Our roundtable of reporters is ready to detail those stories and others, and those reporters include Steve Harrison with WFAE News, who makes his first appearance here on the Roundup. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike.
You look like you're apprehensive, and you should be. Nick Oxner is...
It's the first time you've gotten my first name wrong. That was creative.
Nick Oxner is here from WBTV News, and Doss Helms is back. She's education reporter for the Charlotte Observer. And Glenn Berkins is editor-publisher of QCityMetro.com.
Good morning.
We're all on the radio. You can watch us on Facebook Live, too. Early voting for the midterms began this week. I think 19 polling places opened. What's the turnout been so far? Who wants to take that?
Well, I think they had 11,000 on the first day, which is larger than the turnout that they had on the first day 2 years ago when it was a similar slate of races, so fairly heavy turnout.
That's here, 11,000.
Yes, in Mecklenburg.
It's 133,000 people evidently across the state. How does that compare to previous midterms or even the 2016 elections?
That's right. About 85,000 of those just in the first day alone. We know that there's been increasing importance placed on early voting, a lot of attention given to that, for better or for worse, in the eyes of some people. And so I think elections officials are pleased to see that number continue to inch up a little bit. And at the same time, you have to consider that statewide, that number remains fairly sizable, despite the fact that, 28 counties, a quarter of North Carolina's counties, are dealing with a disaster area right now as well.
Do we know if voting is up, do we know why it's up? Do we know whether this is just an influx of younger people who haven't had a chance to vote in the past, or is it a bunch of partisans, left and right, who are coming out to make their opinions known?
I think I saw in the Mecklenburg first day numbers, in looking at the percentage of Democrats and Republican independents who voted, I think that the number of Democratic voters on the first day compared with the whole cycle 4 years ago was actually a little bit down. So, I think I'm not saying this blue wave isn't real, but I think that Republicans are also excited about this election, too.
I'll say that I talked with a Republican political strategist last night who was excited because Republican turnout was up over 16 and over 14. And that's kind of unexpected, right? But I think it's interesting when you look at the turnout mechanism, more and more campaigns want to get people to early vote or to absentee vote. They don't, they would like for you to go on election day too, but they prefer you do it ahead of time because that gets your vote locked in, you're done. And I think that's what we're experiencing here.
Well, there's a lot of national stories about the Kavanaugh hearings having energized the Republican base. They're angry and they want to come out and support the president, even though the president's not on the ticket this time around. But maybe that's what's happening here if the Republican turnout is higher, right?
Well, potentially, but I'll also say back in a previous life I ran political campaigns. And so, no one pays attention until after Labor Day, right? And so the Kavanaugh hearings coincided with that general time in the election when people start to pay attention, period. And campaign ads have now started blanketing the airwaves. Just turn on WBTV and you'll see them. And so that means...
Why would I want to do that?
You could turn on anyone else, too.
Why would I want to do that?
I have to stand through them waiting through my stories. But you start to see you start to see debates, you start to see a bunch of TV ads, so people just naturally start to pay attention. And so, yes, Republican turnout's up a little, Democrat turnout's down a smidge, although it's still early. But I wonder if that was going to happen anyways, and we just think it's more heightened, and we have a heightened awareness of it because we thought there'd be a blue wave.
Yeah. In 2016, evidently, nearly 60% of people who voted in North Carolina voted early, which indicates pretty high interest in being able to early vote, and a lot of people can't be locked into voting on one day because their job won't permit it, so early voting is important to them if they're interested in voting at all. But a new law passed by the Republican-controlled legislature has resulted in this time being 20% fewer places to cast votes before Election Day. So what does that translate to in terms of raw numbers here in Mecklenburg County, in Iredell County, in Gaston County, et cetera? Do we know?
I think it's hard to know what it means in terms of raw numbers. I think we can talk in generalities. With fewer polling places, we know that when people have to drive farther to vote, fewer people tend to vote. I don't know if we can put a number on that.
Well, I can put a number on it in Gaston County. They have 3 early voting locations. That's down from 5, which seems 5 seems small. 3, why bother?
Okay, you're talking about the number of polling.
We do
places.
have, though, 2 more days, right?
Okay.
19 to 21 in this cycle.
And Gaston actually has more weekend voting than Mecklenburg. I was looking at the 2 calendars, like weekend vote. I live in Gaston County. I'm planning to go early vote Saturday. I think Mecklenburg can't start weekend early voting until the weekend after. I believe in both there's only 1 day of Sunday voting, which is often viewed as sort of a big souls to the polls, get people to go straight from church to early voting day.
And that's what Republicans would tell you. There may be fewer locations, but there are more hours of voting in a lot of counties and across more days. And so it's a debate to be had over which one is better, more places for fewer hours or more hours and fewer places.
So what was the rationale for changing it in the first place?
I think it was predictability. I think now the polls have to be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
On weekdays.
Yes. And I think that was a big part of the argument.
Okay. Because Democrats say this could hurt African-American turnout. WFAE's Alex Olgan reported this week that some Republicans were upset, too, because they say this new law imposes top-down control on local elections boards, which they see as an unfunded mandate. Everybody's angry, so they must be doing something right. Are either of these perceptions correct?
People are always going to have something to complain about, especially with this General Assembly makeup that we have, right? But you see that these early voting sites are set by boards of elections that currently are made up of 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, for better or for worse. And they have the ability. I think a lot of times what's keeping them from having more locations open is the funding, because they have mandated hours that they have to be open, and so it's the staffing and the funding to do more sites. But I think that generally speaking, there are folks who say it's good and folks who say it's bad.
The Republican legislature has made many attempts to change voting rules, for lack of a better term. I mean, and most of those changes were struck down by the courts. Is this another of those attempts?
I maybe, but I don't. That is less obvious, right? We've seen in redistricting, or Republicans have said that they were being very partisan and they wanted to draw all the Republican districts they could. In voter ID, we know that they want people to have IDs to vote. This one, I think, is the one with which there is the least amount of evidence to ascribe a sinister motive.
We've not seen the kind of, or at least it's not been reported, the kind of manipulation that we've seen in some states, Georgia, for example, where polling places were taken out of African American communities and opened in other places, or where people are having to drive inordinate distances to cast an early vote. I would say what I said earlier. There is some evidence that fewer polling places could potentially mean longer drives, and depending on where those polling places are, it could affect certain populations.
Yeah, and Q City Metro reported this week that in 2016, 15 million registered voters did not vote because of transportation issues. Where did that number come from?
I'm not sure. I didn't report that story, so
Okay.
I'm not sure where that number came from.
But you're sure that it's accurate because you are the publisher and editor?
If it's in Q City Metro, it's accurate.
So the lack of transportation to the polls obviously impacts poor people, not those who are, middle class or well-to-do. You also reported on some groups working to get rides for people who have transportation.
Absolutely. There are a number of organizations here in the county that are working to get people to the polls. They don't want anyone to not vote for lack of transportation.
And Uber and Lyft evidently are getting in on this.
Apparently.
What are they doing? Do you know?
They'll give you a free ride to the polls. I mean, it's pretty.
Really?
Yeah.
Will they give you a free ride back? I'm serious. That's a serious question.
Yes, they want to take the barrier away from people being able to go vote, and so they're offering people, within some reasonable parameters, trips to and fro.
Wow. Well, good for them. You mentioned, Steve, a voter ID a moment ago, I think, and the concept of voter ID will be on the ballot in the form of an amendment to the state constitution. It's one of 6 amendments. Some of these, maybe all of these amendments are controversial. It seems that they are, at least, because in some cases the wording of the actual amendment will be decided upon after we say yes or no, or mostly if we say yes, because if we say no, it won't happen. But what's up with that?
So I think with photo ID, the wording is a big deal because there'll be some form, if it passes, some form of photo ID in the Constitution, and then you can go one of 2 ways. You can go the strict photo ID way, which is driver's license, passport, military ID. Then other states kind of expand that to the little picture on your debit card, your student ID, your neighborhood homeowners association ID. So that'll be a big deal if it passes, which way the state goes.
Keep in mind, in North Carolina, you can still use an old family Bible to get your driver's license. So maybe we can bring that to the polls.
But we've talked about this before. If you don't know exactly what you're voting on, and what you're voting on is a constitutional amendment which cannot be voted down by the courts, wouldn't it be important that we know precisely what the wording of the amendment's going to be?
Yeah, one might think.
Is this bait and switch?
But in some of the amendments,
is this a trick?
In some
Seriously?
of them, well, I mean, I think in some that the language was written very vaguely.
It's certainly a blank check.
Yeah.
It certainly gives lawmakers a blank check after the fact. If this amendment is passed, as you said, we don't know what documents would be required or which documents would be accepted, at least. So lawmakers certainly would have a blank check to go in later and.
Well, why did they do it this way? Why didn't they just write the amendment and say, "Here's the amendment, vote yes or no"? Why did they do it this way?
Well, recall that the General Assembly tried to pass, under the Republican control, tried to pass voter ID previously. That was struck down. All of these amendments currently up on the ballot have been subject to some judicial scrutiny. So I think what you saw here was Republican leadership in the General Assembly saying, you know what, we're going to write something that's broad enough that judges can't say we can't do it. And it held up, which is why it's still on the ballot.
Supporters of voter ID, of course, see it as necessary to protect the integrity of the vote. North Carolina Republican Chairman Robin Hayes, who will be on our election special on this program next Tuesday night at 7 o'clock at the Booth Playhouse, he says that if you are a voter and you cast a proper ballot, then I think it's only fair that it not be canceled by somebody who is ineligible to vote crossing out your ballot. What is he saying here, that people will vote in your name and nullify your vote?
I think that's a theoretical thing that could happen. I think they found almost no. When they found improper voting, and that's been a very, very small number, it has tended to be either people who are not citizens or people who were felons and had not had their rights restored. So no, as far as somebody coming in and saying, "I'm Mike Collins," and taking your ballot away, I don't believe they've ever found that.
I didn't think he meant that literally, that someone would vote in your name. I don't know. Maybe he did. I just thought it meant just someone voting illegally, canceling out your vote.
Well, they found, after an audit of the last election, they found 508 votes that should not have been cast out of a total of 4.8 million. Do they know if those 508 fraudulent votes were cast purposefully? Did they know they were voting fraudulently?
I think most were felons.
Okay.
So who didn't have their rights restored. So whether they knew or not.
Would voter ID have prevented that from happening?
No.
And based on news reports, many of them were not aware. Many of them were not aware that they were not permitted to vote.
Okay, we have more to talk about with regard to the election because we have a big one in the North Carolina 9th, and we'll talk about the Harris-McCready race when we come back, or the McCready-Harris race, depending upon your point of view. It's the Local News Roundup on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Habitat Charlotte Restores, where donations of furniture, books, and appliances are sold to create affordable housing. 4 locations, including Wendover and Wilkinson. More at charlotterestore.org. And Francis Dawson of Homes of LKN, serving buyers and sellers of residential real estate in the Lake Norman area for over 14 years. Details at homesoflkn.com. J.D. Vance grew up in a poor Rust Belt city in Ohio and an Appalachian town in Kentucky, and he wrote about his family story in the best-selling book Hillbilly Elegy. Released in 2016, that book spoke to the struggles of white working-class families and a cultural divide that became a theme of the presidential election. Guest host Michael Bitzer talks with him and some of the book's critics who say that Hillbilly Elegy perpetuates misconceptions of the Appalachian region. That's coming up on this program Monday at 9.
Democratic congressional candidates collectively raised more than $1 billion for their campaigns, a new record. Uber and Lyft both prepare to go big and go public, and early estimates put the final cost of Hurricane Michael over $10 billion. We'll follow the news and follow the money on the Friday News Roundup from New Hampshire, next time on 1A.
The Roundup of the Week's news continues on 1A from 10 to noon, right after Charlotte Talks, on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on the Local News Roundup on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. Steve Harrison joins us for the first time from the WFAE newsroom as part of our roundtable of reporters, and Dawes Helms is also here from the Charlotte Observer. That's nothing new. Nick Oxner joins us from WBTV News. I have trouble with you. It's just
You're a troublemaker.
With me or my name?
It just follows you around. Whenever you're here, I can't say your name or where you work. Glenn Berkins is here from QCityMetro.com. One of the most closely watched congressional races in the country is, of course, North Carolina's 9th, which pits political newcomer Democrat Dan McCready, a Marine Corps veteran entrepreneur, against former First Baptist Church pastor Republican Mark Harris, who has not held office, I don't believe, before, but he has run before. Both were on this program on Monday and appeared in a debate at Spectrum News this week where things got a little testy. McCready brought up a sermon Harris gave several years ago.
Let's look at Mark Harris's own words. And this is not an attack on your faith, Mark. I'm a Christian too. But I believe that men and women are each created in God's image. Men and women are equally valuable and equally capable. And it's past time that women had a seat at the table. Mark has said he called women, quote, servant lovers. He questioned whether women should have careers, suggesting that women should be home cooking, sewing buttons, and learning to, quote, my opponent's words, respond to their husbands.
And Harris responded to that in much the same way he did when I brought that sermon up on this program on Monday.
The reality is that they took a sermon I preached in Mother's Day of 2013 and pulled things out of context, which in that sermon, let me just be clear what I said, that we are fortunate to live in a time where women can be anything they want to be. They can be the CEO of a company. They can be chairman of the board. They belong in the operating room, the classroom, or wherever they belong. But it is important to also understand it was Mother's Day of 2013. And when God blesses that woman with a child, her motherly instincts kick in. That doesn't mean that her career ends, nor did I suggest that. But it simply made it clear that her motherly instincts kick in, and everything she does from that point forward, from the operating room to the boardroom, is in the best interest of the child.
So Mark Harris has said that he is sick and tired of his positions being misrepresented. And given what he just said, would you say his positions are being misrepresented?
I'm not sure I'd say they were misrepresented. I think there may be a little nuance, but it sounds like he basically repeated what the ads have said he said.
I mean, this is the problem when you have a job like being a pastor where you get up and talk for an hour every week, is you have a lot of material for your opponents to go and sift through and use against you. And if I were him, I'd probably be a little tired of it too, but that's the price you pay.
And I don't know Mark Harris at all well enough to know fully what his context and his philosophy is, but I do think terms like servant, I mean, obviously as a woman, I don't want somebody telling me I should be a servant, but that is a common term that is used in terms of servant leadership, and I think it is not necessarily used exclusively toward women or any particular group. I mean, there is the idea that any one person speaking for God can define what women are and are not capable of, but I don't know that he is trying to say specifically that he as a legislator would keep women out of any particular roles.
Well, these comments are obviously being brought up because of the Me Too movement. How do you think this is playing, particularly among women?
hard to tell. We have an audience here this morning, which includes a number of women, and I was looking at them as you were playing that audio clip, and they're pretty inscrutable. I couldn't get anything. But I think people are already where they are on that issue.
Okay.
I don't think this is going to move people to the left or the right. I think if you are part of the Me Too movement, you already know who you're going to vote for. If you're not, you know who you're going to vote for.
You're probably more concerned by the Freedom Caucus idea than you are, if you're from that perspective, than you are by what he said in a sermon several years ago.
Mark Harris has said that if he goes to Congress, he will join the Freedom Caucus. Dan McCready has said he will be semi-independent. He wants to start a caucus of veterans. He says because he thinks they believe they will bring new ideas and leadership. Because veterans are having experience of having to work with all kinds of different people for a common goal.
And more than whatever sermon Mark Harris gave a couple years ago, that is the biggest defining factor in the race, right? You've got this Democrat who doesn't want you to know he has a D next to his name and may be a Republican, may not be, who's trying to paint Mark Harris's opponent as a, more very right, ultra-conservative type guy. And so when you have these kinds of, when you start bringing up social issues or things like, what does Mark Harris think about women, it's easier for McCready to say, look at my extreme right Republican Freedom Caucus loving opponent, Mark Harris, vote for me, moderate Dan McCready. And it might help paint an overall broader message
And I think I was going to say one thing at the debate Wednesday. So the first debate was at WBTV a week ago, no studio audience. I thought Mark Harris was really in kind of control. Mm-hmm. And then this week at the Spectrum debate here at Spears Square, there was a big crowd, a lot of McCready supporters. There was a lot of booing, a lot of cheering. And I think Mark Harris got flustered. And so I think some of his answers, I think he was on the defensive a bit and in speaking about the Freedom Caucus. And he was kind of flustered enough that he sounded a bit extreme, which he didn't at all sound a week ago.
I think these kind of attacks cut both ways when you have a minister or a preacher who is running for office. This kind of reminds me of the Jeremiah Wright incident when Barack Obama was running for president. When you're a preacher, you preach a lot of sermons, and you preach them from a certain religious standpoint or viewpoint. And those may not always align with where we are culturally or popularly. And I think this is what happened in this case.
Well, as a preacher, as a pastor, he came out against gay marriage, and that was a religious point of view. Now he's running for Congress, and that's being held against him because the Observer pointed out when they endorsed Dan McCready that Mark Harris took a stand against gay marriage. They quoted his belief that the world is only 10,000 years old. If that is in fact his belief, I'm not sure that it is, but if it is, should that matter? Do we care if our congressman believes the world is 10,000 years old? Should we?
Well, I think if we're going to be discussing science and climate change and that kind of thing, whether he believes in scientific analysis or in sort of a biblical account of things, that could be a relevant factor.
And I thought it was interesting in the debate Wednesday, there was a question about climate change. Mark Harris said, I think the earth is warming, but I don't think man is really contributing. So then it was Dan McCready's turn, and that was kind of an opening. I think that's pretty safe ground for a Democratic candidate, and he talked briefly about it and then kind of veered off into his business, his solar business, and really wasn't willing to engage Harris on that issue. I just thought that was interesting.
But see, that's another instance where you have moderate Dan McCready, middle of the road, who can take a position that's palatable to all people, and you have Mark Harris who's taking what you might define as a more right-wing view, which is the whole playbook that Dan McCready's trying to play.
And of course, if more Republicans turn out because they're angry about the Kavanaugh hearing, that is bound to help Mark Harris because those people are on the same page. Do people trust candidates who don't take a firm stand, who are trying to walk the middle of the road so they can get in? Because once they get in, they can do anything.
Well, I think you've seen campaign ads from Mark Harris and from conservative PACs and what have you opposing McCready, who are trying to make exactly that point. Who is Dan McCready and what does he stand for? I think that's becoming.
Well, I asked him that because the Observer accused him of being a mamby-pamby on a lot of these issues, and he doesn't think he's been. He thinks he's told people where he stands.
Of course, he would say that. Well, you could call it smart politics, right? Smart campaigning. If you're the strategist and this is how you think you're going to get elected to Congress, of course you're going to go out and you're going to try to take the least controversial position in the middle of everything, right? But if you're Mark Harris and you're trying to be painted as an extremist, that's the natural reaction to say, I might have some views that people don't like, but at least I have some, which is kind of what he's saying about Dan McCready.
So you mentioned, Steve, this audience that they had at Spectrum, because they held the debate at the McGlowan Theater here in Spirit Square, and the candidates seemed to have been energized in some way or egged on by this audience because they were applauding and they were booing, a bit like what happened when Dan McCready complained about a negative ad about him being run by Republican groups.
So I'm sorry that I have to deal with an opponent who is lying and his friends who are levying misleading and dark and nasty attacks.
At which point, Mark Harris turned things around, mentioning that a McCready ad that he says took his words out of context.
This race took a very dark turn when Mr. McCready began to run ads that accused me of saying things in messages and pulling things out of context and using those things to try to smear me in this campaign.
Despite the money being brought into this campaign, this race is pretty close. Most pundits call this a toss-up. Will comments like these impact the numbers at all?
Might rile up some specific supporters when, again, you talk about the enthusiasm. It is fascinating, a month and a half ago or so, two months ago, McCready had this thing in the bag by 5 or 7 points, and smartly the campaign was cautiously not putting too many eggs in a basket. Now I think you've seen the polling in that race certainly tighten and flip, and so every little thing that you can do to motivate your supporters is helpful to make sure they go vote.
I think it's really going to boil down, as we said earlier, to turnout. This country is so divided politically. I don't think I've always been mystified by that elusive undecided. There's such a chasm between the left and the right. It's hard to imagine that there are still people kind of stuck in the middle. So I think it will really boil down to, can you motivate your voters to come out?
And does money do that? Because money doesn't always translate into votes cast.
I think anger motivates people.
I want to talk about the money for a second, because the money here is eye-opening. Dan McCready has raised $4.3 million in this race, including $1 million from PACs. Mark Harris has raised only $1.6 million, with just under $180,000 coming from PACs. Why the disparity? Do most people just see this as a Republican walk away, so we don't need to put a lot of money into it?
I think it looked like that a couple months ago. I think now that the race is tightened, that's why you're seeing more attention suddenly being paid from Republicans to this election.
And of course, if you change your mind about whether this is a Republican shoe-in or not at this stage of the race, can you take that money and buy advertising time on television, or is it all sold out already?
I'm sure we'd rustle you up some.
I bet you would. The printing press is churning over there.
And I was just going to say that McCready, they launched this week their ad about the sermons. Everything else that he'd put out before this had been very positive, country over party, et cetera, et cetera. And then this week, and I think that's why Mark Harris was so upset in the campaign, because this week they went after his the sermons.
And you can take, generally speaking, you can take the fact that a guy who once was a front runner and had an all-positive campaign is starting to attack his opponent and go a little negative as a sign that things are tightening. If McCready were ahead 7 to 10 points, you wouldn't have to do things like that.
And McCready, despite the $1 million that he's gotten from PACs, says that he said this many times in the campaign, that if he goes to Washington, he will not feel beholden to those PACs, to the money that people have given him. And he won't be voting for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House should the Democrats take the House back. Can a new guy in Congress really buck both his donors and the Democratic Party, or any party for that matter, and expect to get anything done?
Normally, you'd say, boy, that's a pretty out there position, except there are a lot of Democrats running for Congress this year that are taking positions against Pelosi that are saying things, like that, because they've found, Democrats have seen in the special elections in the last 2 years or so, that Dan McCready type candidates can do very well, and those are the candidates that are winning elections. And so it's you have to wonder, has the party gone out and ordained this kind of middle of the roadism for candidates to go campaign on? Because if it gets you a Democrat majority in Congress, well, then it's worth it.
And he's not the only one who has nationwide who has said he would not vote for Pelosi as Speaker. So I agree. I think he's probably running with that, with the full blessing of the party.
But I think Harris, I think he does make a good point in the debates where he turns to McCready and says, look, you're being naive. If you win, you don't get another option. Like, you're going to have to vote for the Speaker or vote for the Republican. And I think that it's a pretty good comeback.
There was a very interesting article in The Atlantic. I think it was the Atlantic that basically profiled Newt Gingrich, and he actually gave the lie to that when he was elected. Before he was elected to Congress, he basically ran on the same platform, and when he got to Washington, he did exactly what he said he would do. So I'm not sure that you can't run an insurgent candidacy against your own party and even be successful after you're elected.
And
I think one side effect of this massive spending in media is that everybody in the greater Charlotte media market is seeing these ads over and over and over, and a lot of us are not in that district. I think actually some people are going to show up ready to vote for McCready or Harris and be surprised to see that that's not their race. That people, if you do polling day interviews, you see a lot of people do not do a lot of research sometimes. So I would say check your ballot and see who is on your actual ballot.
I think that's kind of interesting, because I got to tell you, when I voted in the primaries, I thought I was in Dan McCready's and Mark Harris's district, and it turned out I wasn't. So unless the precinct line runs directly through the center of my house, my neighbors all have these yard signs for both these candidates, I don't think they can vote for either of them.
Oh, there's nothing saying you can't post a yard sign wherever you want it. Yeah, but I think people will be surprised and confused in some cases.
So more news surrounding elections coming again from the courts. A 3-judge panel ruled this week that changes made to North Carolina's elections board over last year were unconstitutional. What a surprise. But the board can remain in place during this election cycle. What were the changes? Why were they found to be unconstitutional? And if they're unconstitutional, why are we operating under them?
Well, I'll start with your last question first. We're operating under them because they gave this decision the day before early voting started, so it's a little late to be changing things midstream. So this iteration of a court, I think they call it Cooper 4 because it's the 4th lawsuit that Cooper's filed challenging the Board of Elections. This ruling came from a 3-judge panel in which they found the Republicans' efforts to the way they made up the Board of Elections and the county boards of elections was unconstitutional. The counties currently have 2 and 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Previously, counties had 3 members, 2 of which were appointed from the party that the sitting governor. And also this bill, the current law being challenged, included a provision that kept the current State Board of Elections director, a woman named Kim Strack, who some would probably say has had a controversial reign. She's a Republican, married to a Republican lawyer, in place on the staff through a certain date and time, and prevented the board from firing her. Normally they would have had the ability to do that. Now, most of the things they said were unconstitutional, because the governor had traditionally had the power to control election board makeup, and that is less the case in this particular under this particular
and that's why the governor filed the suit. He says they're trying to once again restrict his power.
That's right.
When we come back, we have one more election item to talk about involving a local representative, Rodney Moore, and then we'll talk about CMS security and criminal justice and other things of interest as the Local News Roundup continues on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. We'll be back in 90 seconds. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the Regional Stormwater Partnership of the Carolinas, reporting pollution in creeks, rivers, and lakes will help keep them clean and healthy. regionalstormwater.org, and Belgrave Associates, a marketing firm helping clients align strategy and storytelling with a focus on measurable results for 2019. Details at belgraveassociates.com. Coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, the Roundup will continue with Joshua Johnson and his panel of reporters talking about the week's top stories, including the latest on the midterm elections around the country, the decline of Sears, climate change in the wake of Hurricane Michael. That all sounds familiar. That will continue in 20 minutes, and we'd like to invite you to join us for an election special next Tuesday evening at 7 at Booth Playhouse in Founders Hall. We'll be talking about the midterms here. You get details at WFAE.org/Charlotte Talks. We're coming right back.
The wait has been long, but it won't be long now.
Are you ready to come to Congress with me?
The midterm elections are about senators and governors battling for power, but the midterms aren't just about who wins and who loses, or even which candidate said what. They're about why you vote. They're about issues in your community. They're about you. Listen to All Things Considered and hear the bigger picture every afternoon from NPR News.
All Things Considered, weekday afternoons beginning at 4 on WFAE.
It's the Local News Roundup on Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. Nick Oxner is here from WBTV News. Got it right. Good for me. Steve Harrison from WFAE News, and Dawes Helms from the Charlotte Observer, and Glenn Berkins, editor-publisher of QCityMetro.com, also with us in our roundtable. Meanwhile, State Board of Elections and Ethics Enforcement finished an finished an investigation into Charlotte Democratic Representative Rodney Moore. They've been investigating him since 2017. What were they looking for? What did they find?
Well, they found a whole lot of things. Kim Strack, the director of the State Board of Elections, said to the board this week. So this started as just a routine audit of the Rodney Moore campaign's financial reports that are done periodically for candidates, Strack said. And so they started looking, and they found some irregularities, some inconsistencies, and she said they asked Rodney Moore to sign a waiver allowing the State Board to access his bank records, which Strack said is a pretty routine thing in cases like this, and he refused. So they had to subpoena his bank records for his campaign. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what they found is that he had failed to report more than $140,000 in transactions. That's receipts that he got and expenditures made from the committee combined. And also, Strack told the board that as they were investigating, his treasurer for the board filed some amended reports that added some things, some disclosures, but she also provided bank statements that appeared to have been altered when compared with the bank statements that the board subpoenaed from the banks. So the board voted unanimously to recommend Rodney Moore be referred to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney and his campaign treasurer.
Has Spencer Merriweather said anything about what he's going to do yet?
I don't think so.
Not that I know of.
I don't imagine.
Is it an option? Is it an option? Can they just ignore it?
Yes. I mean, so the State Board of Elections is not a criminal investigating entity. When they find wrongdoing, they have to refer to the state or federal prosecutors. Okay. I think someone's going to correct me on this, I bet, but I think the last time they did this was in a matter involving Fletcher Hartzell, who ended up going to federal prison.
This was a unanimous vote, so I would be surprised if the district attorney's office did not take it seriously.
Right. I think they would not ignore it, but they certainly could come back and say there's not a chargeable offense.
Absolutely.
So Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools said that they would be improving security this year in the wake of the Parkland High School shooting in Florida last year. This week they unveiled the changes that they've made. What have they done in Phase 1, Ann?
Well, the Phase 1 and 2 is a little confusing. They basically had a $9 million plan, and they went to the county commissioners, and the county said, we've got about $4.5 million that's accessible to you now. We're going to approve another $4.5 million, but we're not going to release that money to you until you come and tell us what you're doing. So Phase 1 and 2 are kind of all going on. There's some fencing. There's a big emphasis on upgrading video cameras, so you have better surveillance, more real-time, clearer images, upgrading in high schools and middle schools, but also putting more cameras outside elementary schools where you have sometimes large numbers of mobile classrooms and playgrounds and what have you. And one of the things that seemed to really interest everybody were these new panic card alarms, where basically I'm not sure if every employee or every faculty member would have some kind of card. And they asked about that because somebody said, essentially, are you going to have false alarms? You don't want the equivalent of a butt dial, summoning the SWAT teams. And they said it has to do with the way you tap it. You could send a signal that says anything from there's a fight in the cafeteria, so we need a few administrators here, to active shooter, alert 911.
Teachers will be learning Morse code again.
Maybe, yeah.
This is what Clayton Wilcox told the county commission, because he had to come in and give details of phase 2 of the plan. Here's what he said.
One of the things that we absolutely want to do is put in a new type of hybrid camera system that will allow actually our classrooms, not just our common spaces, to be monitored in the event of a serious situation in our schools. We're also pairing that with some new kind of devices that are part of the theory of the Internet of all things, so that a teacher can instantly touch their lanyard, make sure that emergency personnel are notified, plans for the facility are sent to the police, the camera actually will go active on so the police can see before they enter that. We can also tie that into doorways, locked doorways, and things like that, securing the perimeter.
So that lanyard thing is like the I've fallen and I can't get up button? Seriously?
I think it's something, they call it a panic alarm card. So whether it's a button or whether it's a card, I'm not sure, but it is a device that you would have on your person at all times. And it would also, there's a locator type thing. So you would not only know that, Mrs. Jones is hitting her lanyard, but you would know whether she's in the gym or in her classroom or on the playground or whatever.
So he also talked about limited fencing at high schools. What does that mean?
I don't know. I think it means that there is some fencing, and realistically, fencing is not a protection against an active shooter. It's probably more to deter vandalism or students skipping classes. They've pretty much decided that this idea of, somehow putting a whole campus behind an 8-foot fence with concertina wire on top is not, A, nobody wants it, and B, a shooter's going to be able to get in. You always have to have the ability for visitors and students and parents to come and go. So the last thing you want is somebody in there with a gun and everybody's corralled in by a fence and emergency responders can't get in.
So the county commission gave him half the $9.2 million for phase 1, and they wanted a report back from him on details of what he would do in phase 2, and he did that. So did they give him the rest of the money?
They did. It was a unanimous vote. Sometimes things can get kind of tense. Certain county commissioners tend to, want to ask some hard questions and voice some criticisms, but everybody seemed pretty enthusiastic about what they were hearing.
Something else emerged this week. Some surprising and not surprisingly disputed details have come out of behind-the-scenes discussions between Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools and State Republican Representative Bill Brawley from Matthews about his then proposed bill to allow Matthews and other municipal areas, but particularly Matthews, to start their own municipally operated charter schools. School Board Chair Mary McCrae, Vice Chair Rhonda Cheek, and Superintendent Clayton Wilcox all spilled the beans on this. What did they say?
They all say that at there was a series of meetings between primarily Matthews and CMS officials. Bill Brawley was actually there, and the whole question was, do we go ahead with House Bill 514, the town charter bill, in the 2018 legislative session? And the goal, I think, was to reach some kind of agreement where everybody's happy and we don't need this. Bill Brawley was always saying, if the town of Matthews tells me they don't want it, I'm not going to run it. Mm-hmm. But now they are saying that he turned to them and said, all this goes away, House Bill 514 goes away if you'll fire Charlie Jeter. And Charlie Jeter is the CMS governmental liaison, essentially their lobbyist. He was a state representative, a Republican from Mecklenburg County, and
Steve Harrison, you reported on Charlie Jeter. Give us some background on Charlie Jeter, because he was in the legislature and not particularly friendly to CMS, was he, or public schools in general?
So he was a big charter school advocate in the legislature. I think two of his 3 kids go there now, and I think a lot of the Republicans felt like he was on their team in terms of being critical of CMS and pro-school choice. And so then he stepped down. I think a lot of the ill will started when he resigned his seat 2 years ago, right after winning the primary. And so the Republicans felt like he kind of hung him out to dry. Then he goes to CMS as their lobbyist and is just all in. And a lot of his fellow Republicans feel like they'd have no idea what he really believes.
And he apparently had a meeting with Bill Brawley before all of these series of little dinner meetings with the officials, in which he went in to make the case for CMS and made it in such a way that Bill Brawley threw him out of the office. So this these tensions had been, I don't think anybody denies that Bill Brawley thought Charlie Jeter was a big part of the problem.
So you quote Mecklenburg County Commissioner Jim Puckett talking about Jeter in your story, and you have Puckett saying, when you go from attacking public education on a regular basis, and Charlie did, and I agree with him, to suddenly 180 degrees on the other side, the disingenuousness of where you stand is so blatantly obvious that it's hard to take him at his word. Is this Charlie Jeter, the conservative Republican, or is this Charlie Jeter, the hired gun? What difference would it make? He's working for the school.
Well, that's what Charlie Jeter says. He says it doesn't matter. They pay me now. I work for them. I work really hard for them. And he compared himself or his situation to Brett Favre, the quarterback who played for the Packers and then went to the Vikings, and that Brett Favre wasn't going to not try his best for his new employer, the Vikings. So that's how he sees himself. I'm going to be all in.
I thought the most stunning part of that quote was Jim Puckett saying, we were both attacking public education on a regular basis. Because that has the pitch to the public has always been, we're not opposed, we're supporters of public education. We simply see charters as an addition to the menu of public education. That was to me a shocking way to hear him phrase that, very openly saying that.
So Representative Bill Brawley, the key to this is whether he said this or not. He says he did not say that. He did not say, help me out here. He did
not say that he would make five. Right.
Right. He didn't say that if you do this, I will do that. So if it's not true, what would be the benefit of Mary McCrae and the superintendent of schools and the vice chair of the school board all coming out saying he did?
Well, there are people who would say it's an election season. Bill Brawley is fighting to hold on to his seat. He has a Democratic challenger, Rachel Hunt, and there are people who say that at the very least the timing of this is suspicious, because this has been floating around. There was even a story on TV to completely unnamed sources that said somebody says this happened.
Is Bill Brawley running?
Bill Brawley is running, yes. So he
in a very close race with Rachel Hunt, where Rachel Hunt's made most of her career in education, and in a very competitive district.
But Clayton Wilcox is a registered Republican.
Yes, as is Rhonda Cheek. So, yeah, it's. And
are they Republicans or are they on the school board? It's the same thing that was just said in this quote.
Well, and I will say, Mary and Rhonda did not volunteer this until I directly asked them, and that was because it had bubbled up in a blog, and then Bill Brawley actually called me before any of them had gone on the record and said, if I said this, it would be a horrible thing, but I didn't say it.
Right.
So they were both reasonably willing to come forward. Clayton Wilcox did not want to get in the middle of this. I mean, if he was acting, he's got a great second career in theater.
So it would be a horrible thing for Bill Brawley to have said this, because it would be illegal, possibly illegal, and certainly unethical. He has said, quid pro quo is illegal. Why would I commit a felony over Charles Jeter? He's not well liked, is he, Charles Jeter? And Matthews Mayor Paul Bailey, former school board member, by the way, was at a dinner where this comment was allegedly made, and he says it never happened. Is this politics, or could this actually be a misunderstanding?
I don't think they can all be telling the truth. This was, if you had a room of 50 people, certainly somebody could have heard something and somebody else could have not. This was apparently 6 people around a dinner table. The people who heard it say that they heard him make this comment say it was very clear. It was, there's no way that anybody didn't hear it. And then you're getting kind of these, well, I didn't hear it. He said something, but it wasn't that.
The school board chair, Mary McCrae, kind of upped the ante with a comment that she said about this. She said, anytime there is an election season, 'tis the season to be liars. He point blank said that, she said. Representative Brawley knows he said that. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a lot of big, strong opinionated personalities in this mix, so it's interesting.
So what happens now?
That's a great question, because one of the things I asked people was, if you heard this and it's inappropriate, did you report it to anybody? And I think all of the CMS people, said they did not think it was a good thing to say, but they didn't have a sense that it was potentially breaking the law. So nobody has filed any kind of complaint. I don't know if anybody will. it would, and the legal question, I think, would ultimately come down to, would somebody try to press charges?
I think both you, Steve, and Nick filed stories this week about how county magistrates, we're changing topics here, how county magistrates have recently been letting criminal defendants charged with felonies go free pending trial, as opposed to putting them in jail and making them post bond. Is this part of the new tactics or approach to criminal justice, I believe, that Spencer Merriweather is taking?
Well, I think it's nationwide. There's a big movement toward bail reform that it punishes the poor, that people shouldn't be languishing in jail because they can't pay to get out. So I think here in Mecklenburg County, there's near universal agreement that that's a good thing. However, that there have been cases where there have been some pretty serious charges and people have been given criminal summons, and there are people who think they should have been arrested.
Yeah, and I guess it's important to get a little more context. If you're charged by summons, a sheriff's deputy basically shows up with a sheet of paper that says come to court a month from now or whenever your court date is. Right. If you are arrested, even if you get bail, and a low bail, an unsecured bond, you go to jail and you might be able to easily get out, but it could attach, for instance, ankle monitoring or some other conditions before you go and are tried. And so there are some advocates who say, look, we have some real concerns about using summons to charge for serious or violent felonies. I think both Steve and I have spoken with Chief District Court Judge Reagan Miller, who oversees the magistrate's office. I talked to him Monday, and he said, look, even if you commit a violent felony crime, that is a factor that a magistrate is to consider when determining whether or not to charge you by summons or send you or arrest. And it wouldn't necessarily be determinative of whether you're arrested or not.
Just because you're arrested or summoned does not mean that you are guilty.
No,
in America, you're innocent until proven guilty, and isn't part of the thrust of this the fact that this particularly is onerous for poor people, because if you are arrested, you might lose your job because you can't go to work that day, or for the several days that it took you to raise bail while you're in jail, and then you can't afford to raise the bail, and even if you can, a portion of that gets kept by the bail bondsman, even if you are released as not guilty, correct?
And I think an even bigger part of that dynamic is if you get held in jail for a long time, the system depends on plea bargains. Yeah. So if you have layered on the most serious possible charges, you are perhaps more motivated to plead to something even if you are not guilty in theory.
So we don't have time to talk about light rail being out of commission. It's going to be out of commission, I think, till sometime next week or thereafter, and it's because a tree fell on the overhead wires. Has that increased uptown traffic, or is that just my imagination?
It's increased more people standing by the New Bern station by my house for the bus.
Nick Oxner from WBTV News, Steve Harrison from WFAE News, and Doss Helms from the Observer, Glenn Berkins from Q City Metro.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 W.
Never come back.